Welcome to the limited audio series, St. Louis Suffragists Today, an LWVSTL production. Here we share stories of the League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis. Thank you for joining us. I am Angie Dunlap, current president of the League of Women Voters of Metro St. Louis. In 2020, the League of Women Voters celebrated their 100-year anniversary. We want to honor the women whose shoulders we stand on because the reality of women's rights today was enabled by the women in our past. The oral histories of League leaders capture the voices of women who were studying issues and serving voters in their communities. They were, and we are, making a difference. These audio recordings bring you a series of interviews with longtime League members. This project accompanies the book Raising Our Voices by Nicole Evelina. In today's interview, League member Nancy Thompson talks about the League's involvement in the formation of the Metropolitan Sewer District. Here is a bit from the book about our work to expand MSD. From 1973 to 1974, the League, along with the East-West Gateway Coordinating Council, St. Louis County, and the federal government, undertook a comprehensive study of how wastewater management was handled in the St. Louis area and the problems facing residents, especially the severe water pollution problems in West, Southwest, and North St. Louis County. They found that there were 8 private sewer companies and 5 municipal sewer companies in St. Louis County alone. 2 of the watershed areas were classified as the worst effluent pollution problems in the state by the Missouri Water Pollution Board. As a result of the study, the League believed that extending MSD's coverage area was the best solution. The next step was to try to get MSD's annexation efforts placed on the ballot in the areas of St. Louis County that would be affected. MSD deemed that the League was the most credible organization favoring annexation and asked the League to lead a petition drive and an education campaign on behalf of the measure. Citizens agreed with the need, and the measure passed 6-1 on May 10th, 1977. This is just one issue where the League takes action in St. Louis. Read the book to learn about even more. Now listen to this interview of Nancy Thompson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another interview of a League leader, Nancy Thompson. Nancy happens to be the current vice president of the Metro St. Louis League. And she's always been putting her shoulder to the wheel. And in the early 2000s, she was president of the Metro St. Louis League. We appreciate her joining us today and sharing with us some of her perspectives and remembrances. Nancy, do you recall when you joined the League and why?
Absolutely, I do. It was in October of 1972. I was in Edwardsville, Illinois. I was new in town. I had a new baby as of August 30th, and I didn't know people. I just saw this little article in the newspaper saying the League of Women Voters is going to have this meeting at 9:30 at the Presbyterian Church, and everybody's invited, and here's the topic or whatever. So I thought, that sounds interesting. And they said childcare is provided. So here I am. I took my little bitty baby over there to the Presbyterian Church, knowing no one, and trust my new baby to somebody I'd never met before and walk into the meeting. As luck would have it, and I really do think it was luck, that first meeting was a League consensus meeting. And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever to hear people discussing their viewpoints on something they had been studying for a while and answering these questions and talking about, do we agree on this, or do we not agree on this? I thought the whole consensus idea was wonderful, and that just hooked me on League probably forever.
It is a neat process. I too think that is a strength. That is a real strength of the League. So aside from the consensus process, why is the League important to you?
I really never met a public policy issue I didn't like. So I guess League is pretty much a natural for me. But I do love about the League the fact that we can be a meeting place for people who might not necessarily meet otherwise, especially in a city as large as St. Louis. This is true. I like that we have positions at the national level, the state level, and the local level, so that people can plug in wherever they feel most comfortable. It's a piece of folk wisdom, or political science wisdom, probably, no doubt, too, that people are typically more engaged in their local issues. I think that is true of many people. They're simpler to understand, they're closer to home, they're more specific to a setting. On the other hand, there are those of us who also really enjoy national issues, and I'd count myself in that camp. So it's a place where we can discuss issues with others, but it's also a place where, after going through a process, we can say, this is our position, and we want to really take some action on this. We want to figure out what we can do to make this more likely to actually happen.
This question is somewhat related to what you just answered, but how do you think the League has been important to the greater St. Louis community?
I think we can point to some successes in the past. I'm thinking here specifically of the formation of MSD, the Metropolitan Sewer District, where the League actually was quite instrumental. This is a regional problem that was not necessarily seen by everybody in the community, for sure, as a regional problem. There were lots of tiny sewer systems in various states of chaos and dysfunction. Coordinating all of those into one district that then could evaluate the priorities and make the system much more rational and cost-effective was really a win. It was a huge win for League and for rational political process. I think that foresight that we had was extremely important, and that transcending political boundaries is something that we might be positioned to do. Our reputation and our reality as a bunch of little do-gooder ladies sometimes stands us in really good stead. In other words, taking the moral high ground is not necessarily a bad way to live your life. I felt like it was really important that we do things like that. I'm afraid we've lost some of our zest for that in the intervening years. That is, tackling the regional issues on a regional basis and being brave and courageous, and may I say outrageous at the time by something so drastic as MSD. But by the same token, I think that is an example of some time when League actually made a big difference. I also think that on various issues where speaking out for either innovation or just more cooperation and more progress was really important. Our upholding, of course, of voter rights is extremely important now more than ever. And I think another area where we have maybe made a difference is we provided a place where both white women and Black women could come together in a day when that wasn't necessarily happening all over St. Louis. And I think that's a positive. I know that at times we haven't been as careful as we should have been about being inclusive of people of color in our leadership, but I actually think that there were some beginnings of some cross-racial friendships in the League that really helped St. Louis at critical times. I want to mention one more thing now that I've
Sure.
started to roll on this. Another thing that League did, actually through its members, individual members, and not necessarily as a league, but if you look at the history of an organization such as Focus St. Louis, League members were very instrumental in the founding of that organization, which also has had its time as a real leader in St. Louis, and also has at various times in its history emulated the League process of doing studies and then suggesting some action. They have retreated from that, but I think that a lot of good was done also by Focus St. Louis.
I wasn't aware of that. Thanks.
Yes, indeed. If you delve
Okay.
into it, you'll see a number of prominent League ladies involved in that.
As a League leader, what was the most challenging thing you faced?
The way I saw it at the time, and I think if I could transport myself back in time, I'd still see it that way. The most challenging things were two. One was getting younger people involved in the League. I was a young Turk, actually, at the time, but our leadership and our board were very gray hair dominant, as I am now. It didn't look like a cross section of St. Louis by any stretch of the imagination. So I worked very hard, and I'd have to say without very much success that I saw at the time, to try to get younger people interested and involved in the League. At that time, most of the really educated and really smart young women were entering careers. They felt like League process was just too time consuming. They couldn't attend daytime meetings. It was a challenge at that moment to try to move the League away from its habit of a lot of daytime meetings and things that working women couldn't possibly attend. All of this kind of conspired to make it difficult, I think, to attract young people. And as now, young people like to be around other young people. So when you don't have them, it's a real snowball effect. I'd say that was probably the number one challenge. A close number two challenge was the constant thing in the back of my head. Hey, we have to be really careful to get more women of color involved in leadership. We had some great ones in my day, but we didn't have enough numerically to reflect the population of St. Louis. And we needed more diversity of all kinds, actually. Recruiting people was somewhat difficult if we had our blinders on about our white privilege. It wasn't that anybody in early 2000s was discriminating consciously. It was just they didn't have the awareness sometimes of how certain issues and topics and geographies for meetings and so forth played out.
Thank you for that insight. That's very helpful. Now, what were some of the most important public policy and legislative issues the League tackled during your time as a leader? And talk about now, because you're a leader now, as well as the early 2000s.
Okay. Louise, I have to tell you that when I was asked this question the first time, I was blank about it. And I'm equally blank about what were our public policy issues. As I said, I loved every public policy issue. So I just rolled with whatever was happening out there in the community. I don't remember that there was any one huge public controversy about local issues during the time that I was president. Now, of course, today we face entirely new threats and challenges in our public dialogue. One is certainly we feel like many people are actually disenfranchised in the state of Missouri due to extreme dominance of one of the political parties. So I think our work on redistricting this year to get fair redistricting was enormously important work. I feel like we might have accomplished just a bit in terms of coaxing and cajoling the House Advisory Committee, at least, to come up with a plan. The Senate one did not, but that's a whole nother story. But I do feel like we had a bit of effectiveness in that, and certainly all committees and both houses of the legislature, when it ultimately landed there, were aware that the league was watching and that the league wanted to take, again, what I'd call the ethical high ground on redistricting, that we wanted to support and help whatever efforts there were by academics and even just amateurs who wanted to work on the demographics and so forth to make some reasonable districts. So I feel like that was reasonably successful, but I think the public policy challenge is how to work today in a world where disinformation and misinformation has been normalized, where people try to sound perfectly reasonable while they're spouting out totally unreasonable and non-factual information or even just made up stuff. I think that's a huge challenge and a huge public issue. In other words, how are we going to conduct ourselves as a democracy if we can't even agree on some ways of conducting ourselves? I'm going to say some essential qualities of democracy and how those play out at the local, state, and national level. I think that's the big number one public policy issue. Of course, there are many others that we care about. We care about climate change. We care about healthcare. We care about abortion rights. We care about voting rights, of making voting easier and understandable for people. We care about effective and efficient government at all levels. We care about representation for all people and all viewpoints. We care about civil debate, all of those things. But if we can't agree on some ways of conducting ourselves, I think that in itself is a public policy issue that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, it certainly has become one. In the past, it was understood that you engaged in civil discourse, but now not so much. I was glad to hear you talk about your awareness of the need to diversify the league and engage in more inclusive practices. That was going to be one of my questions, but you've already answered that.
I think it's hugely important because this is what we're actually asked to do in a democracy, is to get along with, converse with, have dialogue with all kinds of people. And if we are one basic racial identity, ethnic identity, educational background, even political perspective, it's not going to be representative of the electorate, and we're not going to be nearly as effective as we could be if we were able to be perceived truthfully as representative of the population. I think that's very important. It also is the workshop for learning to get along with people that are different from you, who have different life experiences of all kinds. And I think we need to prioritize that.
Thank you. Now, of course, the league is nonpartisan, and I was wondering, were you ever hamstrung by the nonpartisan position we must maintain? And were you ever accused of favoring progressives over conservatives or conservatives over progressives? Did that partisan issue ever become difficult to manage?
I don't really think it was difficult to manage. Part of that is just because of my personal background. I had been a local government employee in so many places where it was either outright against the rules or it was against the norms for me to express any partisan political preference. In other words, even when I'd be a department head in some government, I wasn't allowed to have a preference or have anybody, period, know who I was going to vote for in an election for mayor. So nonpartisan was second nature to me, and that's why maybe as a leader, it wasn't difficult. Now, I will say at times, I can recall one person who is today a league member who actually dropped her membership, I believe, during the time I was president or shortly thereafter, because she was of a party that she perceived to be the minority party among league members. And she probably wasn't incorrect, if we tell the truth. So at times, it was an issue for members.
I can understand. I experienced a little bit of that too, I think. But fortunately, the members involved hung in there and they're still members.
That's good.
Yes.
That's what we want.
Yes, absolutely. Men can now be members. Of course, as we know, the league started out as all women, but they can now be members and have been able to be members for quite some time. Do you recall men who contributed to the league's work?
Yes, I do. I cannot resist saying to you that I was a delegate to the National Convention in 1974, which was the convention when men were allowed to become members. It was a very interesting debate, and there was much conversation at the time about whether we also needed to change the name of the organization. So there were proposals about LOV, League of Voters, or this or that might be the alternate name. And the argument that carried the day, which I think is a fine one, is no, women go to the YMCA exercise. Why not men come to the League of Women Voters if they can embrace our goals? Yes, I think some men have made real contributions. I want to say that the most memorable ones over the years have been in the form of committee service, actually, where some men really dug in and helped out with various studies. And then, of course, most recently, we had one of our executive committee members, Steve Smith, was our treasurer and was an enormous help to the league, actually, at the time he took that office. We've had men who helped out with the investment committee. We've had men who did actually many different roles. Today, Don Crozier is definitely one of the leaders of the St. Charles unit, and he helps out with the website statistics, does several things for us, and is a real asset. So I think the men who can get past the barrier of becoming a member of the League of Women Voters make good contributions.
Absolutely. You touched on this a little bit, but maybe you'd like to expand on this. The changes in the political climate. So how have changes in the political climate over the years affected the league's work?
I think that's the biggest change, actually, in league over the years. It's becoming more and more difficult to be able to engage our own members, let alone other people, in a civil dialogue about differences that might be deep-seated differences in either party identification or more likely just general political orientation. So I think that's difficult. I also think it's become extremely difficult for a league to operate in an environment where basic functions of the league, such as voter registration, for instance, are under attack in our legislature. And therefore, things that we as league members took for granted would be accepted in the community as nonpartisan, as community-minded, as helpful, such as answering voter questions about where to vote, how to vote, when to vote, absentee voting, all of that, as well as activities of registering voters and giving perspectives and information on items that were tangential or central to ballot issues. Those things used to be taken as community service, and a great community service on the part of the league. Now it's just as likely that someone will disagree with our basic stance of providing this information because they have a whole different perspective about what civic life should be about.
Some of what we've done, there's an attempt to criminalize it, actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very difficult to operate when we might become criminals and lose our own right to vote if we violate some little tenet of the new law that the Missouri legislature passed. And one cannot imagine what the intention of that law was, except that we have this dark suspicion that it was to make sure that we who are perceived to be more on the progressive side of things, which would include league now, I'm afraid, would not be able to register as many voters. It'd hold down and, yes, suppress new voters.
Yeah. As we look to the future, and that's part of our future, what changes do you foresee for the league?
I hope that we as a league will continue to reach out to try to attract members from every echelon of society. I hope that we will therefore continue to think about what are the things that young people, working people, disabled people who are dependent on public transportation, all kinds of people who are somewhat different from the average in league, what will they need in order to participate in our meetings and our events and be full members who are engaged in study and action? I certainly hope we continue to think about that and to challenge ourselves to do better and more. Along those same lines, I think that we are having probably a member retention challenge at the moment, because what tends to happen most recently is as soon as there's an adverse thinking at the moment of the recent Dobbs decision in the Supreme Court, then our membership tends to balloon. Now, what has been happening, though, in recent years is that membership falls off in the next few years because those people don't find their way into meaningful league involvement. This relates to another challenge that we have, which is almost everywhere else in society. I'm going to say that people join organizations that are focused on a single cause, if you will. They join an environmental organization. They join a racial justice organization. They join this or that kind of organization. And the league is one of the few games in town where we try to help people be at least conversant along an entire range of public policy questions and issues. So I always think that one of our strengths is our ability to be nimble about what public policy issues we're involved in and to present somebody with a wide array of information. They don't have to be specialists in all these league positions or committees, but they can obtain enough information about a whole variety of public issues at all three levels of government that they can understand the issues when they arise. They know how to approach a public policy question so that they know how to think about their vote and who to vote for and how to vote on ballot propositions. And I think that is an enormous strength that we have as a league. And I hope we continue to capitalize on that. I know there are those that want to shrink our program drastically, but I'm not one of them, because I want us to have a lot of choices for what people can do in the league. And I want our membership to be exposed to a broad range of public policy questions. I am one of the people who had experience on the board of both the city league and the county league before the two leagues were joined. And this happened fairly shortly before I was president. And I think that was viewed as a real asset coming into the presidency, is I did understand how the city league worked. I understood how the St. Louis County League worked, had lived in both places and worked both boards, and had a feel for the differences. And they were very real differences at the time of the combination of the two, how those differences might be resolved and how we might support each other.
I'm sure that was very valuable at the time.
I think it was at that time. Kay Winsine and I have known each other in about 3 or 4 different ways, but Kay Winsine had known me before I was president, and she talked to me about that. I know when she called to ask me if I would be nominated, that I could go both directions and help with the integration of the two leagues.
This has been a fascinating interview. So thanks so much, Nancy. And I want you to enjoy the rest of your day.
Welcome back. I liked this reminder from Nancy. The league had the foresight to see that a regional issue like MSD transcends political boundaries. And my thought, how might the St. Louis League do that in the future? Nancy also spoke about democracy's need for civil discourse and how we talk about policy that with those we disagree with has become its own public policy issue. An essential quality of democracy is being able to discuss differences. Note that you heard how the League's voter education in today's world competes with misinformation and disinformation that are so prevalent. Beliefs are supplanting facts. Unfortunately, misinformation has been made to sound reasonable, and figuring out how to reach groups who are set on making decisions based on incorrect information is a challenge. A final takeaway from Nancy. It is a plus for the league to use our do-gooder reputation to speak out, being courageous, and even sometimes being perceived as outrageous, while advocating for something that will be good for the whole community. Let's continue being courageous. Thank you for listening today. Thank you to our LWVSTL Centennial Committee, who worked many hours to honor the suffragists of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This oral history was made possible through the generous donations of League members. It's produced by Cindy Lenz and Angie Dunlap. Thanks again for listening.